Hello chums, and welcome to Taming a Monster, the series where I take some of Gran Turismo 7's most ridiculous cars to see if I can tweak them so that a talentless pleb like me can handle them without being killed to death. Like any common ruffian, I'm using a bog standard PlayStation 5 controller, and I have all driver assists turned off, except for ABS. Let's see what car is trying to murder me today. Today, we have a car that I've received a few requests for over the last few months. The 959 was Porsche's answer to the Ferrari 288 GTO, which was arguably the world's first purpose-built hypercar. With four-wheel drive and only 800 horsepower or so, it may seem slightly tame by the standards of some of the cars I've featured in this series, but the statistics only tell half of the story. As usual, all of the upgrades have been applied, including the wide body and increased body rigidity upgrade. However, the settings have not yet been touched, aside from the downforce, which has been maxed, as many players are likely to do, and the transmission, which has already been adjusted to suit this car. The wheels are in the standard size. Increasing the size can make the car change direction more quickly, potentially at the cost of stability. It has a front splitter for front downforce, and a rear spoiler for rear downforce. If you're interested in learning more about aero, downforce, or any other aspect of tuning your car, I have a series called Tuning for Beginners which covers everything from suspension to differential to the transmission. I picked the terrible Dragon Trail Gardens circuit to test the car out because the Monster series has been through most of the other tracks by now and I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel. As for the 959 itself, it's a total mess. In the previous video, I tested a Pontiac Firebird which had the problem of massive power oversteer and noticeable liftoff understeer. Missed me! This 959 has the opposite problem. It understeers on throttle as the front end lifts, meanwhile lifting off seems to result in almost uncontrollable oversteer. There are rare occasions where the oversteer can be used to pretty hilarious effect with some Gymkhana style maneuvers, however very few people would manage to control this 100% of the time. Usually, my first changes would be to the natural frequency to prevent body roll. However, the liftoff oversteer was so violent that I tried adjusting the limited slip differential first. I maxed out the front initial torque and set the rear to the minimum, which usually helps with liftoff oversteer in four-wheel drives. Acceleration was increased to 40 all around, to slightly reduce power understeer, and braking sensitivity was also reduced to make the brakes feel sharper, especially since braking sensitivity seems to make very little difference to braking oversteer. Ow! Absolute twat. It did not help. Typically, the adjustments I just made with the limited slip differential work well with front-engine four-wheel drive cars, however the weight bias in this car is so far rearward that the differential tweaks didn't help as much as they possibly should have. There was an ever so slight improvement though. Move, you slag. Next up, I increased the natural frequency and anti-roll bars to reduce body roll. I increased the rear anti-roll bar more than the front since this can help with braking oversteer. Hopefully this will now give me a slightly better base on which to make further adjustments. Whilst the liftoff oversteer wasn't improved, the reduction in body roll made the car feel much nicer to drive and changing direction felt a lot less sketchy. On flat tracks, this setup could actually be a lot of fun. The issue would come about when you try to take this car to the Nurburgring, because it will absolutely kill you. I then increased compression, which can help reduce bounciness over curbs. I then reduced camber, more so at the rear since this can also help with oversteer when braking. I then zeroed the rear toe angle to help with understeer when accelerating, and I added front toe out, which is supposed to reduce liftoff oversteer. While the car was better, it still had a lot of liftoff oversteer as well as some understeer when accelerating. This car would almost definitely need more adjustments made before it was ready to take on the Nordschleife. Without adding any weight, this was the best setup I could come up with. It's mostly controllable on flatter tracks, however if you take it to the Nordschleife, it will more than likely result in your demise. Case in point. Jesus wept. The final setup only needed the weight of an extremely obese English bulldog added to the front axle to make the car just about controllable for this track. It still has the tendency to oversteer, as Porsches do, so this setup doesn't take away the Porsche vibe. If you'd like to completely neuter it, however, you can add more ballast to the front, which will make this car much easier still to drive. On the Nordschleife, the 959 somehow feels easy to drive and completely out of its depth. It's easy because the four-wheel drive system makes the car great for low-speed corners. Floor it on the way out at the right time and the car does the rest of the work with no drama. but then certain sections can completely upset the car with its typical Porsche-iness shining through to try and slingshot you into the next postcode. The lack of weight over the front axle also makes the 959 very susceptible to front-end lift when going over crests, or when hitting a curb, which is not ideal since the front end is what does the steering. The 959 is a car that probably should have been a bit more competitive than it currently is. When you consider how overpowered other Porsches can be, the 959 will somewhat let the side down, despite having the massive advantage of all-wheel drive. As for where this car would come on the leaderboard, it was difficult to guess, since the slowest all-wheel drive we've had so far is the Escudo-swapped GTO with nearly 400 horsepower more, along with more downforce and an engine that isn't located in the wrong place. Still, you'd think, with all-wheel drive traction and over 800 horsepower, this shouldn't be too far off 6 minutes 10, right? In the end, the 959 got a rather disappointing time of 6 minutes 22, placing it not very far ahead of a van. Bit shit, really. So, that was my attempt to tame a monster. I hope my settings helped, or that you enjoyed this video. Join me next time where I try to tame the Skyline R31 with the engine from the Skyline R34. Thank you very much for watching, and if you're feeling particularly generous, I would greatly appreciate your subscription. Take care, and ta-ra.